So good morning. Thank you all for being here this Saturday morning for the second day of our event. My name is Camila Maroja. I'm currently assistant professor at Colgate University, but last year I had the enormous privilege of being a postdoc here at the Kogut Center for the Humanities at Brown University. So today we are continuing the event Unearthing the South, Indigeneity, Globality, Community, which started last night with the screening and discussion of the fantastic movie, The Embrace of the Serpent, that also counted with the presence of one of the script writers, Jacques Toulemonde. In this brief opening, I would like to tell a little bit of the story of this event, how it came about, and why we are gathered here today. So earlier this year, Brown faculty renamed the fall weekend holiday Indigenous Peoples Day. The gesture came after the members of the Native Americans at Brown Student Organization presented a resolution to the Brown University Community Council calling for the name change. The gesture of renaming the holiday would, and I'm quoting, recognize the contributions of Indigenous people, Native Americans to our community and to our culture and foster a more inclusive community, end quote. Those of you who were at Brown in October 2015 remember the debates that agitated the campus, especially concerning the legacy of displacement and oppression of Native American people, as well as their contribution to present-day America. These discussions spurred the students' request. At the time, I talked to my own students who expressed their difficulties in articulating an informed response to pseudoscientific claims assuming the importance of colonialism. Talking with my colleagues, we acknowledge our responsibility as educators and parts of the Brown community to provide a counter-discourse that would give the students the base that they needed to articulate other narratives. Just as the Narragansett and the Wampanoag people who inhabit the land we are now standing, many other groups across the hemisphere have resisted against violent erasure of their culture and cosmogonies. We'll hear some of their stories today. The Pemon, the Taino, the Tupi, the Moche, the Ondoke, the Kofan, the Kresnaki, and countless other groups have kept in their material productions and narratives the key for how they situated themselves in relation to the rest of the natural world. Today, with a series of interdisciplinary talks, we locate indigeneity at the core of America's history. We will hear stories of reciprocity and interconnectedness of the fluid boundary between humans and non-humans, and learn about how these stories can impact our lives and notions of knowledge. With this symposium, we hope to respond to our students' requests, as well as to provide a deeper knowledge to the Brown community, hence in continuing the gesture that the university initiated by the name change earlier in February. On behalf of my co-organizers, Iris Montero, Felipe Martinez Pinzon, and Jennifer Lamb, I would like to acknowledge all the people that have been involved in the preparation of these productive 2 days. And as Philippe mentioned yesterday, this event, we are very happy because this event brought the university really together. So I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of History of Art and Architecture, the Brazil Initiative, the Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies, the Department of Hispanic Studies, the Department of Comparative Literature, the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, the Humanities Initiative, the Arts Initiative, the Watson Collaboration Grant, the Department of Anthropology, the CV Star Foundation, Education Lectureship, the Science and Technology Studies, the OSCE of Diversity and Inclusion, and finally, the Kogut Center for the Humanity. The Kogut Center in particular has been instrumental in helping us to conceptualize and materialize this event. I would like to mention their wonderful team that really materialized and help us throughout the preparation of these 2 days. Kit Salzberg, Trod Kastner, and Melissa Chang for their invaluable support. And it's also my great pleasure today to introduce Amanda Anderson, Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Humanities and English, and the Director of the Kogut Center for the Humanities, who will say a few words before we open our first panel. Thank you, Amanda.
It's my great pleasure to be here this morning, and I just want to say a few words about what I take to be the exemplarity of the process that led up to this conference and of the two original co-organizers, Iris and Camilla, who expanded their team wonderfully to include Felipe and Jennifer. Last year, Iris and Camilla came to me. They're both postdocs in the Kogut Center, which is we have a large group of fellows, including faculty, 8 postdoctoral fellows each year, 4 graduate students, and 4 undergraduates who are holding annual fellowships. And we convene weekly for a weekly seminar. And there is a sort of general call made at the beginning of the year. If you have any programming ideas, come and see me. Camilla and Iris came with an incredibly ambitious plan, and they wanted to do a big conference on knowledges from the South. And what impressed me most of all was, first of all, that they thought big from the start, and they were sort of undaunted by the possibility that, you know, they might need to raise a lot of funds. They showed themselves to be incredibly resourceful in writing proposals and raising funds. But they also were just incredibly, I want to say, comprehensive and rigorous as they worked through identifying people who might be able to come and make this a really extraordinary event. So from my perspective, there's nothing more wonderful than having 2 postdoctoral fellows come and generate a project like this, and it's quite rare. I also want to say that I want to second the praise for the staff. I have the best staff in the universe. Having said that, the fact that not a single problem was brought to my attention during the entire run-up to the conference also shows to me that Iris and Camilla are amazing organizers, and also, you know, profoundly autonomous, which is great. So I welcome everybody here, and, you know, look forward to hearing the talks. Thanks.
Amanda. So I will introduce Dana Graff that will be chairing our first panel. So Dana Graff is a postdoctoral fellow in international humanities at Brown, where she's affiliated with the Department of Anthropology, the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, and the Kogut Center for the Humanities. She received her PhD from Yale University in Anthropology and Environmental Studies in 2015. Her current research examines the intersections between environmentalism and agriculture in Costa Rica and Cuba, and she has also conducted long-term research on social and environmental change in Costa Rican indigenous communities.
All right, thanks so much. Is this audible? Yeah? Great, okay, great. Pardon? I will speak very closely. So welcome to our first panel. Okay. Welcome to our first panel, where we have two wonderful papers that I had the privilege of previewing before this morning's session. So our first paper is by Heather Roller of Colgate University, On the Verge of Total Extinction, Reframing Indigenous History in 19th Century Brazil. Heather received her PhD in 2010 from Stanford University, and she's now an associate professor of history at Colgate University. Her book, Amazonian Roots, Indigenous Mobility and Colonial Communities in Northern Brazil, which came out in 2014, examines how spatial mobility played a role in the formation and consolidation of indigenous communities in the 18th century Amazon. It recently won the Roberto Reis Book Award from the Brazilian Studies Association and the Howard Klein Prize from the Conference on Latin American History. Her new project is a comparative history of 3 independent Indian nations in different regions of Brazil during the 18th and 19th centuries. And as a quick note, we're going to hold questions and discussion for the end, so we're just going to go from one presentation to the other. So go ahead, Heather, thanks.
Hold this microphone and walk with it? With that? It's wireless, right? Okay. Just one moment here. And you can all see? Yes, it's up. Okay. Thank you all for coming today. And thank you so much to Camila and to Iris for the invitation, and to the whole team for organizing this event and bringing together such an interesting group of people. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So in 1902, a search party found Guido Bogiani's camera, tripod, and glass plate negatives smashed and buried near his bones. These remains, scattered across a remote area of the Paraguay-Brazil borderlands, confirmed the murder of the Italian traveler a year earlier. They also led investigators to a little-known indigenous group called the Tumraha, who, it was said, had killed Bogiani because they associated his photography with witchcraft. In contrast, the Cajueo, with whom Bogiani lived during 2 extended trips to Brazil in 1892 and 1897, had permitted him to take dozens of portraits like these. The women, in fact, were quite eager to sit for him in his telling, for which they received hair pomade, glass beads, cloth, and sugarcane alcohol. The surviving negatives, those not destroyed at the time of his death, were later developed and published as an album of postcards, which were popular for their depiction of elaborately painted native women. In his travel diaries, Bogiani expressed a sense of urgency in recording Cajueo artistry and other practices. He did so not because he foresaw his own untimely death, but because he viewed the Cajueo as the last vestiges of an indigenous nation that soon would live on only in memory, destroyed by imported diseases and vices like the very alcohol that he distributed. And I have this quote to read to you from his travel diaries. He said, "If all the photographs I have taken come out well, this single collection will be of considerable value. It will not only preserve the character of a tribe that is on the verge of total extinction, it will also preserve the memory of its extraordinary aptitude for ornamental art, which gives it special distinction among all the indigenous tribes of the Americas." In this bleak assessment of the fate of a people, Bogiani was not alone. 19th century ethnographers across the Americas described vanishing Indians and remnants of Indian nations. I think we can all pretty easily recognize that genre of writing with its images of native poverty, addiction, detribalization, and demographic collapse. Scholars have looked at the ideologies behind this so-called salvage ethnography, and they've analyzed how 19th century notions of evolution and race and civilization informed ethnographers' predictions of native extinction. Those ideologies, however, are not the focus of my talk today. Instead, I'd like to consider how we might move beyond a kind of declensionist narrative, so a simple narrative of decline in writing 19th century indigenous histories. Can we read those same early ethnographies differently, placing them within a broader context so as to detect traces of native emphases, views, and purposes? The 19th century ethnographies, I'm going to argue, contain evidence of indigenous ways of dealing with outsiders and their impositions in this period. What seemed to those writers, and what perhaps seemed to modern day scholars, to be signs of decline or crisis, might in fact have deep roots in native societies that had lived and learned through centuries of contact. To see those roots, as I think historians of Brazil have begun to do in really interesting ways, we have to look at a longer-term register of sources. My research in regional archives in Brazil has convinced me that we do actually have this kind of record, problematic and mediated as it is, for a range of different native Brazilian groups, including the Kayapó do Sul, the Xavante, the Bororó, the Mura, the Munduruku, the Botocudo, and the Cajueiro. This last group is going to be the focus of my talk today. They're also, you'll see the name written also as Caduveio, which is how it appears on this map. The Cajueiro are the living descendants of the Guaicuru nation. And originally, this equestrian society lived in the Chaco, in what is now northern Paraguay, where they raided Spanish ranches for livestock. They forged a few short-lived alliances with Spaniards on the western side of the Paraguay River, which you see running north to south here. And they also experimented very briefly with Jesuit mission life. But in the late 18th century, some Guaicuru groups decided to take advantage of their position near the border, the sort of indeterminate border that was roughly the Paraguay River, and they began trading stolen goods on the eastern Portuguese claimed side, and also taking refuge there near Portuguese forts and garrisons, refuge from Spanish punitive expeditions sent against them. So you can see from this map that over time the Guaicuru generally moved north. I don't know if you can see the dates in parentheses, but the Guaicuru dates change as you go north and progressively east over time. And this is in what is now the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso do Sul, in and around the Pantanal wetlands, which you might have seen tourist brochures for those. In 1791, these Guaicuru groups made a lasting peace treaty with the Portuguese, whom they had previously terrorized on the monsoon routes to the mines of western Brazil. Over the next several decades, thousands of autonomous Guaicuru came to live seasonally in the vicinity of Portuguese forts like Coimbra on the upper Paraguay. Their interactions and intrigues with the fort commanders produced a huge documentary record, much of which has survived in the state archives. This official documentation continued more sporadically after the end of Portuguese colonial rule. So this is the broader context in which I am reading several proto-ethnographies, and I say proto in the sense that they were written by amateurs, that focused on this Cajueiro subgroup. The ones I'll draw from today, and I'm sorry if I butcher the French, are by Francis de Castelnau, a French naturalist in 1845, Guido Bogiani, the aforementioned Italian traveler and artist who lived with the Cajueiro in 1892 and 1897, and then finally Emilio Rivasseau, a French surveyor who lived for a couple of decades in western Brazil around the end of the 19th century. Back in the 18th century, the Cajueiro appear in the records as one of 6 subgroups within the larger Guaicuru nation. Colonial authors describe them as the most bellicose, the least acculturated, and the most opposed to a sedentary way of life. They were also the only ones who endured as a distinct ethnic group. 6 subgroups of Guaicuru were still described in the 1840s, but just 3 appear in the 1860s, and only the Cajueiro appear in records from the 1890s onward. As this trajectory suggests, the 19th century was a fatal century for the Guaicuru, as it was for so many indigenous groups across the Americas. I think that we have yet to fully understand how a group like the Cajueo managed in this context to nurture their independence. What I'm going to argue is that they used strategies and modes of interaction that had been developed over centuries of contact with others. In trying to kind of categorize these practices, I've come up with 3 that I'm going to talk about today: alliance, appropriation, and resistance. I'll briefly consider each of these in turn, reading these early or proto-ethnographies on the Cajueo for evidence of adaptation and creativity rather than simply rupture and decline. Over the last 30 years, anthropologists have shown how engaging with others through war, trade, and other means is an essential feature of lowland South American societies across time and space. As a historian, my goal is to ground observations like those historically and show how an indigenous group in Western Brazil faced the challenges and conflicts of the 19th century while drawing on earlier experiences of war and peacemaking during the colonial period. My first theme is alliance. Ever since their formal alliance with the Portuguese in 1791, and continuing with their service to Brazil in the Paraguayan War almost a century later, the Guaycurú had received military titles and uniforms. 19th century writers commented frequently on both. Castelnau, who encountered one dressed up capitão in the 1840s, ridiculed his use of a tricorn hat and a musty old suit, which he said had been worn backwards. It had been inherited from the grandfather of a predecessor, and Castelnau thought it looked a bit worse for its generations of wear. And this photo is the Cajueo leader known as Capitãozinho, the little captain who hosted Bogiani in his village and posed for one of these formal portraits in a uniform that was likely earned by an ancestor in the Paraguayan War. So if the ethnographers described them as kind of shabby relics, what did these symbols actually mean to the Guaycurú and to their descendants, the Cajueo, over time? It's clear that martial symbols found a lot of resonance in Guaycurú warrior culture, and that the titles, patentes, which are like military commissions, and decorations fit well into native hierarchies of leadership. The alliances that the Guaycurú and Cajueo had made with the Portuguese, and later with the Brazilians, whom they continued to call Portuguese, were symbolically linked to these items of military rank. Revealingly, when the Guaycurú believed that the Portuguese had breached their peace agreement, which happened at the end of the 18th century, they turned their indignation upon those symbols first. So I found one document in which a colonial fort commander described how one of his officials had encountered a chief who was preparing to desert Portuguese territories, quote, with his uniform and his patente ready to send back to me or to use in war if the Portuguese came after him. These uniforms and titles then carried a great deal of historical weight. For the Cajueo at the end of the 19th century, their alliance with Brazil was what guaranteed their control of territory, namely the large reserve that was demarcated at the end of the century in 1899. The Cajueo claimed to have won the reserve through their participation on the Brazilian side in the Paraguayan War. The possibly apocryphal story is that Dom Pedro II promised it to them, the emperor. Rivasot tells us that the reserve was actually cemented by a political alliance the Guaycurú or the Cajueo had made with a regional strongman. The early ethnographies also reveal that the Cajueo maintained strategically friendly relations with individual ranchers who had helped defend them against their enemies. The Cajueo of the village of Naliki, where Bogiani stayed, even came to count Bogiani as a key ally, in part because, as they said later, he was the first Branco, the first white, to live among them like a Cajueo, eating as they ate, dressing as they dressed, and even buying a native wife, a Shamakoko slave, for a brief time. He's kind of shockingly candid about these arrangements in his travel diaries. This is, I think, a deeper pattern. Short-term, selective alliances with useful outsiders go back to the colonial period. Let's now consider the second theme, which is appropriation. The early ethnographers tended to see appropriation as something that degraded Indians. And they wrote a lot about native dependence on imported vices, as they called them, like alcohol. Indeed, alcohol features prominently in declensionist narratives of indigenous history in Brazil as in other parts of the Americas, so I thought we should just focus on that. Castelnau, who visited the Cajueo in the 1840s, said that the passion for aguardente had already taken hold of a group camped out near a Portuguese garrison, a Brazilian at that time garrison, and that they even sold their beloved horses and guns to satisfy their thirst for it. This would not seem to bode well for cultural integrity. Neither do the early passages of Bogiani's diary from 1892. When he arrived in Naliki, the main Cajueo village at the time, he was bombarded with requests for sugarcane alcohol or pinga. The villagers would ask for large or small bottles, or even just a cup on credit. Bogiani claimed it was soon impossible to avoid getting entangled in trades involving his supplies of alcohol, and quickly he was conducting an irresistibly good business in hides, meat, and artifacts. The hidden cost for him was that he could not sleep well at night after making a trade because the whole village erupted in singing and dancing until all the alcohol had been consumed. He also, he found, had to be very careful to favor the chief of Naliki in his distribution. I have a few points to make about this. One is that it becomes clear, if you read Bogiani's entire travel diaries carefully, that Cajueo consumption of alcohol was at this time sporadic, occasioned by the appearance of outsiders or a visit to a local trading post. They would get a bottle or two, drink them immediately and with collective festivity and total immoderation, and then they would go several weeks without any. They may well have been addicted, but they weren't making the changes in their way of life that would have ensured a regular supply. The other point I would like to make is that we see similar modes of consumption and exchange in the colonial era sources. You find the same low stakes, short-term trading for alcohol, as well as tobacco, and the desire to stay at a good distance from the world of the whites while taking advantage of periodic contacts with them. Despite the intensity of what can only be described as an acquisitive process that played out around the colonial forts and garrisons, the Guaycurú were known for maintaining their social distance and their habits of mobility. Most notably, they refused to settle permanently in aldeamentos, the state-administered villages that were intended to turn wild Indians into tame villagers. And just as Bogiani learned to be generous with the chief of Naliki, colonial officials had learned to privilege the Guaycurú over their other less demanding native allies like the Guaná, giving 10 times more alcohol to the former, according to the Portuguese fort commander who actually attempted to quantify this difference. The same commander noted with some irritation that during their seasonal visits to Coimbra Fort, the Guaycurú captives and their families expected to be hosted in his quarters and to eat whatever he ate at their dinner table each day, while the visiting Guaná dignitaries had to sit on the floor with only plates of beans. What might at first appear as abject dependence, in other words, could actually serve a broader goal, that of making whites useful in the reproduction of native power and prestige. I should also mention that the ethnographies from the end of the 19th century show that the Cajueiro still had many horses and firearms, half a century after Castelnau predicted they would sell them all for alcohol. This balancing act could not be maintained forever. By the mid-20th century, we have plenty of evidence that Cajueiro herds had dwindled and that alcohol dominated the trade within and across the borders of the reserve. But for a longer period than scholars have generally acknowledged, indigenous peoples managed to appropriate the knowledge and goods of the whites without having to join white society or live according to its norms. This is an ongoing effort that anthropologists have described among the contemporary Cajueiro and a range of other native groups in Brazil. The last theme I wanted to discuss is resistance. When Castelnau visited the region in the 1840s, the Guaicurú still conducted raids across the border and inspired terror among the Paraguayans. He said of the Paraguayan soldiers who once escorted him to and from a fort that, quote, every termite mound seemed to them a Guaicurú ready to attack. You're supposed to laugh at that. I just love that quote. But this had ended by the 1890s, according to Bogiani and also Rivasot, who said that the last Cajueiro raids in their old Chaco stomping grounds had occurred 7 to 8 years before their last visit. By that time, the Cajueiro were getting their native captives through barter instead of war. Rivasot described them as essentially defensive in their posture and said that they tried to evade rather than confront the armed expeditions that were sent against them by land-hungry ranchers. Along these lines, the 19th century sources usually described the Guaicurú and the Cajueiro as warriors whose glory lived on only in stories and bravado, in mock fights staged for visitors, or in ritual fights during feast days, of which we have a number of descriptions. But these same texts reveal that Cajueiro armed resistance was hardly a vestige of the past. In the 1890s, Brazilians in the region still very much feared the Cajueiro and were actually reluctant to accompany the rather intrepid Bogiani into their territory. Upon arriving at the first Cajueiro encampment, one of Bogiani's traveling companions, he said, fell into a dark mood, quote, his head filled with all kinds of stories and fears of nocturnal assaults, thieves, serpents, ferocious beasts, and all the great dangers to which he was exposed. To venture further into Cajueiro territory, Bogiani actually had to send the rest of his fearful party back to the main Brazilian trading post. He was then accompanied to the village of Nalique only by his Chamacoco servant, who presumably had little choice in the matter. The Cajueiro were also known for raiding the homesteads of settlers who had swindled them and issuing orders of expulsion to others whom they did not consider friends. Bogiani described how one settler ignored such an order and then had his homestead invaded by the Cajueiro, and only Bogiani's intercession on his behalf saved the place from being completely looted and got the settler an extra couple of months' permission to remain in Cajueiro territory. It makes sense that the Cajueiro focused their efforts on a more geographically circumscribed area by the 1890s. By this time, remember, they had a hard-won, more defined territory to defend in the form of the reserve. Let me now conclude. Both Bogiani and Rivasot described the Cajueiro as being on the path to extinction, with Bogiani estimating that fewer than 200 Cajueiro remained in 1892. When Levi-Strauss came to the reserve in 1935, he too estimated that there were only about 200 left. He saw decadence and decline everywhere he looked. But between his visit and the writing of Tris Topik, he read some of the earlier ethnographies, especially Bogiani's diaries. Lévi-Strauss admitted in his book that what he initially saw as unstable or decadent had been recorded by earlier and later visitors in almost exactly the same form. For example, he feared that this had been his last opportunity to collect Cajueiro face painting designs, but he was gratified to see that the anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro had managed to gather nearly identical designs more than a decade later, around the end of the 1940s. Both of these, furthermore, closely resembled the designs compiled by Bogiani some 40 years earlier. It should come as no surprise that the 20th century anthropologists had to pay dearly for the portraits they took of the painted Cajueiro women. Lévi-Strauss has this great anecdote about how the women forced him to pay to photograph them, and also forced him to photograph them so that he would have to pay. So here, again, I think we see ways of dealing with pesky foreigners and the appropriation of the photographic project. Rather than proof of decadence, in other words, it's an example of the Cajueiro drawing on some of the modes of interaction with outsiders that had worked for them in the past. This only becomes clear when we, or Lévi-Strauss, look at a longer-term record. The same director who made Brava Gente Brasileira in 2000, which, have you seen that movie? Brava Gente Brasileira. It's kind of a classic, but it's a fictionalized account of the 18th century interactions between the Cajueiro and the Portuguese. The same director, Lúcia Murat, recently filmed a kind of follow-up documentary on the reserve. It shows that these selective engagements continue even in the era of evangelical churches and satellite TV. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. So our second paper this morning is Amerindian Shamanism and the Politics of Things by Pedro Cesarino of the University of Sao Paulo. Pedro is a professor at the Department of Anthropology in the University of Sao Paulo. He's a specialist in the study of shamanism, verbal arts, translation, and anthropology of art, which are the major subjects of his 4 books and several articles on Amerindian peoples of Amazonia. Thank you.
I don't have, actually. Well, I don't have a PowerPoint, so perhaps I can begin. I have some images. Sorry? Then if we have some time left in the end, I can show some images. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Can you listen to me? Now? Fine. Now can you listen to me? Okay. So. Writing about the centrality of processes of monumentalization. Can you read them? All right? Can you listen? In Western societies, the French philosopher Régis Debray observed that the South must have other practices of memory, not necessarily attached to, quote him, the religion of the patrimony that was spread by the West throughout the world. This religion of monumentalization entails a regime of memory and its corresponding configuration of power. After all, monuments, be they material or immaterial, related to architectonic constructions or to written documents, are essential to the perpetration of historical societies and their collective memories, states the historian Jacques Le Goff. The monument, written or not, is a signal of the past, strictly related to essential functions of the spirit, such as the mind and the memory, with whom the word, according to Jacques Le Goff, shares the common Indo-European root, man, present in the Latin terms such as mens, mind or spirit, memini, memory, as well as in monumentum. More recently, Mary Carothers revised the studies of memory and introduced the perspective of the memoria rerum, or memoria ad res, different from the well-known memoria verborum, which is the ability of the mechanical and exact repetition of an information or a text. The memoria rerum, in contrast, was in pre-modern times about a subject under study, the objective or thing, res, to be discussed, and in this vein able to build the character, to produce wisdom, and to improve the soul. This capacity and practice or role of memory are directly related to the problem of the invention and should therefore be differentiated from the aforementioned verbatim memory, as well as from the collective or cultural memories, says Mary Carothers. For her, the memory about the subject could shed a new, although the concept is actually old, light for the understanding of civic monuments, such as the Vietnam and the Lincoln memorials, taken by her as didactic examples. Both are strictly dependent on a capacity for recovering to subjective experiences the subject, res, of war, or of civil rights, which is a capacity which is strictly dependent upon the localization of this experience, since the location of the physical monument is capable of triggering the intentio, an old rhetorical concept related to the way, the manner, or the emotional color, or the topic, again, res, which is under consideration. Public monuments or rhetorical places are repositoires of this mnemonic invention of its specific emotional investment that produces what the moderns conceive as a public convention. Because of this, the physical disappearance of a specific place does not entail the disappearance of the place of memory, which is at a certain point independent of its concrete counterpart. In 1657, the Portuguese Jesuit priest Antônio Vieira wrote his famous Sermão do Espírito Santo, the Sermon of the Holy Spirit, where he compares two kinds of nations and faiths by the metaphors of the statues of marble and myrtle. One made out of stone is firm and constant. The other, molded from a shrub, is flexible and inconstant. The first refers to nations that are difficult to subjugate, but are faithful when the process of domination is finished. And the second to peoples which seem to be easily dominated but are rather undisciplined, as capable of imitating the ways of the colonizer as of transgressing them. The people of the New World, and especially those found by the Portuguese along the Atlantic shore of South America, as is well known, were considered without faith, law, or king. From the point of view of the colonizer, they did not have a state, a religion organized around a dogma or a book, nor writing, science, technology, or durable architectonic constructions such as temples and monuments. The Amerindians of the South American lowlands were considered as prototypes of the primitive, the negation of the achievements of modern civilization. The presumed lack of physical monuments, as well as their immaterial counterparts that must be registered by a written culture, were and still are one of the reasons for the misunderstanding of Amerindian peoples permanently kidnapped by the mirror constructions of Western narratives of the other, as well as by its political strategies of domination and genocide. Can I have this? So, What are then the alternative interpretations for this lack of writing and durable architectonic monuments in lowland South America? How is it possible to understand Amerindian conceptions of materiality, image, and power as an alternative ontological configuration instead of a permanent epistemological and political failure? I cannot discuss deeply today here this supposed absence of writing, a problem that I have studied elsewhere, and that obviously depends on what conceptions of writing we adopt. But let's, for this moment, concentrate on the problem of memory, materiality, and its political consequences. The anthropologist Alfred Kreber wrote a long time ago that Amerindian arts from Amazonia should be considered as less developed than the visual productions of the Inca, the Maya, and Aztec civilizations, essentially because the Amazonians were unable to distinguish between art and artifacts, and therefore could not develop a high figurative art. Kreber's aesthetical judgment and its Hegelian premises, argued recently the ethnologist Peter Gao, are predictable, since all aesthetic judgments are produced from an arbitrary position. The judgment, however, presupposing this universality of representation, imagines that everywhere this representation should be directed towards the development of a figurative high art. The Piro from Peruvian Amazonia, where Peter Gao have worked, indeed have a category, as well as all Amerindians, that could be translated by the notion of representation. Yagluchi, which is a term that refers to photography, shadows, and pictures generally. What is not evident, however, is that the Piro were not interested in developing a figurative high art from this background. The Piro people have, in contrast, a complex production of graphic patterns applied in clothes, basketry, and human bodies as a way of showing and producing persons through relations of kinship and affection. This is a knowledge attributed to the wise old woman, which are able to replace in human bodies the lost patterns of the placenta and thus create a new involvement for the living. By the use of psychoactives such as ayahuasca, the shamans can also experience the patterns that are diffused throughout their bodies and the surrounding space as a kind of announcement of the anaconda spirit that threatens the person until he or she realizes that this manifestation is actually a lie. It is only after this stage that the person transforms him or herself into a kind of spirit and sees other spirit bodies. This is again a common pattern in Amazonian shamanisms. For the Piro, however, these bodies are actually the temporary bodies of spirits that they decided to adopt only for this specific encounter. This is why, according to Peter Gao, the Piro are not interested in a figurative art, for they can see themselves, I quote him, the forms that the spirits choose to appear. So let's come back to a point that was left open before. These Amerindian categories, such as the Piro Yagluchi, which is equivalent of many others, such as the Caron, for the G-speaking people of central Brazil, the Ang, which is the word for the Tupi-speaking peoples, and Yoshin for the Panoan-speaking peoples. And there are two problematic ways of understanding these categories. The first would be to project the distinction between abstract or schematic and figurative art to explain the opposition of categories used for graphic patterns from one side, which is Kune in Pano, and for the other side, the category used for pictures, Yoshin in Pano also. This alternative was used by several ethnologists and comes from an automatic transportation of a classic distinction of Western art theories and practices. The second is to explain concepts such as Yoshin, the double. Actually, this is the concept of the double. As if they were opposed to physical bodies, thus reproducing another Western set of polarities such as soul, body, immaterial, material, etc. In my previous work on Marubo shamanism, I decided to translate Yoshin as double, since the category is actually a relational concept and not an independent substance, such as the body or the soul. Marubo shamans explain that each bodily extension has its own potential double, be it exactly like its extension or not. In other terms, for a corporeal extension such as a chair, for instance, there must be a double chair or a chair double that can cause pain in the back of those who sit for hours in the same place. The same is valid for less important animals such as bugs and earthworms, whose yoshin or doubles can enter into the person and cause sickness. A shaman will then be called to extract these pathogenic doubles from the flesh of the patient. The problem arises when the person establishes contact with doubles that are different from his or her corporeal extensions and that have a generally humanoid aspect. Birds, such as the thrush and many others, have an owner of its carcass that monitors its bird aspect from a distant position. Once threatened by a human, the owner can take revenge and send magical projectiles to the person. Other carcasses, or animals, have even more dangerous doubles, such as the anaconda and the spider monkey, which could kidnap the person's yoshin and cause a severe sickness, which can be cured only by experienced shamans who are able to retrieve the lost double. Although specifically elaborated by Marubo shamans, this distinction between a corporeal extension and its humanoid double is present again throughout Amazonia and elsewhere. This is why Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, a Brazilian anthropologist, seconding the anthropologist Brice Aubert and the Yanomami shaman Davi Kopenawa, offers the following justification for the translation of what I am calling double as image, while reflecting upon the Shapiri spirits of the Yanomami. I quote him. And to complete the picture, Viveiros de Castro, I'm quoting, we can note the somewhat paradoxical nature of an image that is not at once non-iconic and non-visible. What defines spirits, in a certain sense, is that the fact that they index characteristics, effects of the species of which they are the image, without, for these very reason, appearing like the species of which they are the image. By the same token, what defines an image is, for us, for the moderns, is its eminent visibility. An image is something to be seen. It is the necessary objective correlative of a gaze, an exteriority which posits itself as a target of an intentionally aimed look. But the Shapiripa are interior images, inaccessible to the empirical exercise of vision. Hence, they must be the object of a superior or transcendental exercise of this faculty. Images that are as a condition of the species of which they are the image. Active images indexes which interpret us before we interpret them. Images which must see us in order for us to be able to see them. End quote. So the Shapiripi are then similar to the Marubo Yovovo and many others among Amazonia, which is this multitude of spirits that are present since the first times in their own invisible and virtual positions, attached to what nowadays we see as the body of animals. But this connection between bodies and their double images is actually related to that previous relational background that I was speaking about. Every corporeal extension must have its double, at least for the Marubo mode of existence. This means, for example, that from the point of view of this room where we are now gathered, we are its doubles, or yoshin, as well as our bodies are seen as a house from the point of view of our internal doubles. This is the image that you're seeing. These internal doubles or brothers are also persons that have painted and decorated bodies. They are wise and actually better than this external person body, which lives in what the Marubo calls the death land. The person, however, should be understood as the complexity produced by the relation double carcass, as well by its ornaments and things such as hammocks, necklaces, clothes, and houses. The person is actually an extended relational field that blurs a net distinction between interior, exterior, human or non-human, material and immaterial. Persons are body houses, which is the same word, actually, one word. Actually, if we can merge these two words into a single concept that intends to show the scalar configuration at stake, houses as well as graphic patterns, other objects, and obviously other persons or relatives are not symbols for persons. They do not stand for something else, but rather extend the person in a complex relational configuration. Houses and objects are not exactly the property of individuals, their belongings or treasures. The relationship of the person with his or her things, the person can be called the owner of things, is more a type of involvement or encompassment, as well as a form of prosthetic connection. If the person must be understood by his or her extension to implements such as houses and graphic patterns, then why should this relation be conceived also by the image of prosthetic connections? The idea was actually employed first by Marilyn Strathern in one of the most difficult books of contemporary anthropology, Partial Connections. The well-known theory of the cyborg developed by Donna Haraway was transformed for Strathern's reframing of anthropological comparative theory in its revision of postmodern excesses of criticism as well as of the traditional scientific asymmetrical base of the discipline. But this is not what I'm concerned today, okay? And what interests us now, however, is the specific use that she has of the cyborg for the understanding of the Melanesian person, which was conceived by her as a circuit of different figures or components by Marilyn Strathern, right? Not by Donna Haraway. So the Melanesian person was conceived as a circuit of different figures or components, such as shell strands, matrilineages, spirits, yams, and pigs. Strathern explains the difference between the two cyborgs, the Western one and the Melanesian one, in the following way. So those are the shell strands in Melanesia. The distinction, I quote Marilyn Strathern, the distinction between the Melanesian cyborg and Haraway's half-human, half-mechanical contraption is that the components of the Melanesian cyborg are conceptually cut from the same material. In other terms, end quote, in other terms, the distinction nature-culture or organic technological that is reframed by Haraway's notion of the cyborg could not be transposed to Melanesian mode of existence. I think that this idea could be adapted to the Amazonian case also. It is impossible to conceive a person in Amazonia independent of his or her extension to what we conceive as material or non-human, as artifacts or as ethnographic objects. The expanded person cannot be understood separately from its implements, since the polarities that ground such a difference belong to Western ontology. There must be then another way to conceive this complex person and his or her circuits. I can comment these images later, okay? Just let me finish. It is not by chance that throughout Amazonia and elsewhere, houses and sometimes villages are abandoned and burned when someone dies, especially when a chief which is conceived as a kind of encompassing body of or for relatives, passes away. Among the Marubu, the things that were previously attached to the person carry its shinan, a notion that could be translated as vital principle, but that is sometimes also identified with a humanoid double. Photographs can be considered dangerous and were feared in first contact situations, for they kidnapped the double image of the person. Nowadays, a growing conscience of fiction is beginning to alter the notion of image a conscience that, according to Jean-Pierre Verneuil, in his classical study of ancient Greek funerary statues, is what distinguishes between the modern psychological notion of image and the double, or double image, as Viveiros de Castro and Bruynes-Aubert translates the term, the Yanomami term. Everywhere in the lowlands of South America, objects are made to be destroyed, to have a short life in a ritual cycle, such as those of the masks and funerary poles of the upper Xingu River. Then what can be concluded from this brief description of Amazonian conceptions of personhood and its regime of objects? The excessive permanence of things could produce several problems, such as sadness and sickness in the living. The objective is then the contrary to the conservation of tokens from individuals, which in the Western world are remembered in public monuments, museums, archives, funerary architecture, and the conservation of personal belongings generally. The dead should forget the living and vice versa, and transform themselves into almost anonymous ancestors, following an eschatological pattern which is completely different from the cult of nominated ancestors in state societies such as those of the kingdoms of Western Africa, Yoruba, Fon, Je, Ife, etc. But this abandonment of places and villages does not entail a sort of forgetfulness, as well as an independence from the exterior material realm, from the interior, as in the Western rhetorical conception of memory. Mary Carruthers said that the memory of places is kept regardless of their physical destruction, or rather that the significance of a monumentalized place is actually projected from the subject into the external world. There is no such an ontological gap in Amazonian modes of existence. It is exactly because the external world is extended or connected to the person that the circuits should be transformed when death occurs. Afterwards, different points of the landscape are still known by the living, who will nevertheless avoid open comments about and tours to ancient villages and cemeteries, as well as explicit references to the personal name of the deceased. There is nothing more contradictory to Amazonian modes of existence than the permanence of the memory of individuals and the preservation of monuments for the society. An institutionalized society that bears the names of ethnic groups such as the Yanomami, Marubo, Bororo, and so on, is actually an imposition from the colonizer and its necessity to identify, control, and destroy the original native forms of organization. These are actually conceived around a body made out of kinship relations and the circulation of knowledge through the aesthetical production of the person, as many ethnologists have demonstrated. As Viveiros de Castro and others have shown, a body is above all a position, a perspective created by kinship and not a transcendental vision from the top. In a recent interview with Ailton Krenak, one of the most important Brazilian Amerindians leaders and intellectuals, I asked why exactly the Krenak and other people paint their bodies. And he answered, we are hunters of the beauty. We hunt the beauty in the world, in the landscape. This is what you call spirits. We are printing in our bodies the specters of nature. We want to be recognized by them. End of the quotation. Contrary to the general Western conception of a beauty that is projected from the individual, from the internal or subjective brilliance or of outstanding persons whose conquest should be memorialized, the focus in Amazonia is literally elsewhere and outside. In other terms, there is no such a thing as an individual and its counterpart, the social institution, but an effort to make transformative connections, to produce affective alliances, in the words of Ailton Krenak. Of course, that alternative modes of existence, such as the Amerindians, can be dangerous in their own terms, since the extension of the person into his or her surroundings creates constant threats to its permanence, coveted by competing positions that also conceive themselves as real or prototypical human people. But this danger, nevertheless, does not rest upon the possibility of destruction of its condition of existence, which is always preserved. Competing positions need a permanent background to create their intricate relationships of conflict and transformation. A background, or in other terms, a world that is conceived to last and to host a living. Western societies, in their turn, create an illusion of eternal permanence by their monuments, whose weight and high cost are actually and ironically compromising the very possibility of a common future. Shall I show some pictures? Do I have time or not? Shall I comment the pictures? Do I? Okay. So these are drawings made by the Marubush in the 70s and collected by another anthropologist that worked there before me. And they show exactly the body of a person and its internal doubles and its objects, ritual objects, which is a ayahuasca bottle and rapé, which is the tobacco powder bottle. And this instrument is to sniff the tobacco powder, okay? So you can see that everything is attached. And the drop of a person, I think it's, can you listen to me? The drawing of a person depends on of its components. You don't draw an individual isolated from its components. Again, the same thing, then here the doubles are inside of this space which for themselves is a house, as the place where we are, you know? And in the other drawing, the doubles are outside, but again, attached or related to this person, okay? And the center of the drawing is the heart, which is also the Shinan, the place of the thought, which is not in the mind, in the head, but at the heart, okay? The third drawing is again collected by Delvair Montagner in the 70s, is the draw of a cosmic, actually, it's a kind of cosmogram, and then you see longhouses scattered throughout the cosmos. Each color actually shows a layer of the cosmos. So you should see this, this drawing in a kind of Gestalt configuration, since what happens is that he's a kind of is detaching one house from the background, you know, because he's talking about this longhouse, which is the longhouse of the shaman, the body longhouse, the body house of the shaman, from where the double of the shaman can come out and by this path visit other spirit people that lives in their infinite spirit houses. This is Antonio Brasil, one of the shamans that I've worked with, and he asked me to take this picture. And again, what he does is to present himself with all his belongings. I don't like exactly this word, but this is himself, actually, you know. Himself is this. He must be shown with his Paca spear, actually, Wino spear. It's not a spear, it's a, I don't know how to say this. Sorry? Staff, exactly. And then here in his chest you see, again, the small bottle to store tobacco powder, and in his back, which is the second image, the previous bottle that they used to also to store the tobacco powder, made out of a bamboo section, okay? And nowadays they use this, which is the white people's bottle for storage of medicines. And then the thing to sniff the tobacco powder in his right hand, which is a very important instrument that I cannot talk about this today. This is Manuel Sebastião, which was my brother, my older brother, and my mother in his right or left. Nazaré, which is drawing him. He's he's a kind of apprentice of shamanism, and in a break from his training, he came back home and was drawn by his mother because these drawings exactly produce what Ailton Krenak was saying. They attract. It's a kind of imitation of the beauty of the spirits. So these are drawings that only shamans can use, and they are actually brought from outside. There's something going on with this microphone. These are images from the Piru people, taken out from the paper of Peter Gao. Then you see a girl coming ready after his process of initiation of puberty. Then she shows herself completely covered with patterns, which is a signal that she's ready for producing other bodies. So then this ceramic that she carries also is covered with patterns, and this shows that it's a ceramic that can be used for store manioc beer, which is something that real people drink, which is also something that made out to produce the body of real people. So the body of real people is connected to several of the things that are used to its production, such as manioc beer. So it's this dish actually is a kind of extension. It's a component of bodies. Bodies are also dishes and patterns, and so this last picture actually comes from the Shipibo Conibo from Peruvian Amazonia. It's actually an example that I use quite often because under you have, below you have this, you could interpret this as by the distinction between figurative and abstract, because you have suddenly a face which comes out of the composition. But this is actually a mistake, because when you see patterns such as in the first image, you already see a person. You don't need to have a face to see a person. So if you have a person here, down here, this is just how can I say this? You don't need exactly to have this face in order to know that you have a person. The index of a person is exactly the graphic pattern, because a graphic pattern presupposes a body, which presupposes a person, which presupposes kinship relations, and so on. This is why this is not exactly a symbol or a representation or something, but much more something like an index, something that points towards the existence of someone. That's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you both for your very thought-provoking papers, which each unearthed the South in different ways. So I'm going to be, in my brief comments right now, trying to link together some of the themes that I saw between each of your presentations, and also tying it back into the broader theme of the conference. So the overarching description for the conference today mentions how the Western imposition of systems of knowledge, even when they're new hybrid forms, has obscured local ways of thinking. So in my reading, each of your presentations or talks identifies and examines different processes of obstruction that have emerged through North-South encounters, and seeks to make those obstructions or misreadings visible and perhaps to counteract them. So to unearth the South, Heather Roller questions narratives of decline and imminent extinction that have perpetuated in European visions of the Guaycuru indigenous nation. She shows that despite frequent predictions of extinction by Europeans, the Guaycurú continue to adapt and live on through strategies of alliance, appropriation, and resistance. One key point for me from your paper is just that indigenous knowledge is not just knowledge about plants or landscapes or ways of utilizing natural resources. It also encompasses knowledge about strategies for living in a changing world of transnational encounter, conquest, and imposition. So your paper shows us that things on the surface are misread as appropriation and by implication are believed to be indicative of cultural loss may in fact have deeper meaning in the societies that adapt or appropriate, whether it's a military uniform as you showed us or possibly as we saw in the film last night, the future use of a compass. So in turn, Pelleiro's paper shows how a Western way of thinking, in this case monumentalization, and a focus on physical permanence led to a misreading of South American lowland Amerindians as primitive due to a lack of physical monuments or a supposed lack of writing, when in fact this Western emphasis on the immediately visible was actually failing to see or made the West blind to the complexity and sophistication that was present among these communities. This complexity includes ideas that there's interior images, that objects are made to be destroyed, and that the human is interconnected to the material and the non-human world. Or for me, the idea that I kind of got out of your talk is that things are impermanent but also interconnected at the same time. Whereas in the global north, through monumentalization, perhaps, we feel disconnected and we value permanence, and maybe our monuments become a different way to establish a connection. So I'd like to bring your two presentations together through two parallel themes, that of permanence and impermanence, and extinction and continuity. So I think that part of unearthing entails understanding why things are obscured or buried in the first place. We can ask why the West or the global North values permanence or large physical monuments, and also at the same time sees extinction in a place that doesn't have them. So I wonder if perhaps an eye that has been trained to identify continuity or durability with large physical structures like the Washington Monument might be more likely to assume fragility or imminent extinction in a place that does not have those particular markers, I wonder. I also wonder if a Western opposition to extinction of all kinds and parallel efforts to save people and plants might be a reflection of an aversion to impermanence. So one of the final scenes of the wonderful film that we saw last night, I think, illustrates these competing white and indigenous worldviews around permanence, impermanence, extinction, and continuity. This is the scene at the end where we have this white northern scientist who finally reaches what he learns is the last sacred Yacruna plant after this long search. Then when Karamakate, his guide, reaches out to pick the flower, the white guy freaks out, right? Because he wants the species to be documented and preserved. But Karamakate's view was that it should be consumed and become part of each of them. So to me, that scene is really emblematic of a lot of what's going on in both of your presentations. We have this Western aversion to extinction on the one hand. Perhaps for the scientist, this last plant becomes a kind of monument. And an indigenous sense of interconnection, but also impermanence, which could shape these two very different ways of engaging with or reacting to the world. So I've been asked to kind of open up our discussion by posing a question to each of you. It's a little incoherent, but bear with me. So one part of this is to think a little bit more just about these ideas of extinction or continuity and permanence or impermanence in each of your work. So as I said at the beginning of my comments, I think you're each dealing with these ideas of misperceptions in different ways. So Heather, for me, your approach shows us a vision of how to counteract expectations of extinction by writing a different narrative of continuity. Whereas Pelleiro, for me, your approach is exploring a little bit more, digging into where and why these misperceptions come from to begin with. So I guess my kind of two-part question is for Heather, whether you have any further thoughts about where these visions of extinction may have emerged to begin with and why. And for you, Pelleiro, I'm curious if you have any other thoughts on what one might do about these gaps in perception and valuation. How does one respond to this idea of monumentalization, or perhaps come to see or appreciate impermanence in the West in ways that might not currently be taking place? So that's a few kind of thoughts to get our discussion going, and then we'll go out to the floor. So.
I just want to give you some props for that excellent effort at tying together these papers. And I especially like how you brought it together with that final scene in the film.
Thank you.
I think that's quite compelling. So, yeah. Sorry, this is too high. In terms of your question of where the narratives of extinction come from, I've just started reading about salvage ethnography as a kind of genre. So I don't feel so well prepared to answer this, but I had kind of noticed that tendency to, you know, that I was reading a lot of these 19th century proto-ethnographies from Brazil, and so many of them would predict extinction, would focus in on these figures that would suggest demographic collapse, and kind of express, it's very common for them to express a sense of urgency, like in that Bogiani quote that I showed you, that these things have to be collected and stored for the future because soon they would not, there would be no living exemplars left. And so I noticed that pattern. I didn't know that it was classified as salvage ethnography until recently. And I was like, oh, that's such a great way to describe it. And I think that it was a tendency that's really emerging in the late 19th century, from what I understand, in part in response to actual demographic declines, right, that are being noticed by new cohorts of professionally trained anthropologists, but also travelers like these proto-ethnographers that I'm reading, and a focus on collecting these artifacts and putting them in museums for posterity. And then, of course, there's also, on the sort of darker side, there's evolutionary theories that are circulating in early 19th century anthropology that are basically tying extinction to a kind of something that is seen as being based in biology, that this is something that is inevitable for native peoples to go extinct. And ideas about race and racial hierarchies also are coming into play. Yeah, I could say more, but I think I'll stop there.
I don't know if I understand exactly your question.
So as far as the views of kind of permanence and impermanence, how you see, kind of how might one respond to that? I understand your paper is kind of explaining the roots of them, but then what might follow from that?
What might follow from
Yeah.
that? Well, I don't know. It's a difficult question, actually. What might follow from? Yeah, I'm thinking with myself before saying something. I think that we should learn from this, actually, more than everything. It's time to learn with other modes of existence because ours is collapsing long ago, but nowadays it's collapsing even more. So I think that this is what I have to say. They developed a kind of technology of non-durable things that are conceived for its specific relationship with persons and kinship and etc. Actually for knowledge, and us, what we do is even, of course, that when an anthropologist gives a paper like this, he exaggerates in the contrasts. So no, he generalizes too much. That's part of the methodology of anthropology, And we have impermanence also. We have all conceptions like in performance and a lot of artistic productions of contemporary art. But even so, in this small example, for instance, what you have, you buy a performance, you collect, okay? You buy for a very high amount of money. So you transform everything into things. And once you transform things into things, you can sell the relationship with the person which is behind the thing. And perhaps what we should do is this, is to understand that relationships cannot be cancelled, that relationships should be kept going and produce a kind of transformative space for dialogue.
Great, thanks. Questions from the audience? Yeah.
I really enjoyed the papers, and I wanted to ask two questions. To Heather, you do a good job of saying when there's continuity
Thank you for that question. It's always, I mean, you're a historian, so I appreciate the where's the change in the story question. And I don't want to tell a story that, I mean, I have to be careful because I do not want to imply that it is only a story of continuity. I don't want that to be the main takeaway point, is that there is continuity. I think that what I'm trying to do is say that there were new challenges facing indigenous groups in the 19th century, and that, you know, across the Americas, but focusing on this area of Western Brazil. Yes, you have ever larger groups of settlers coming to this region, particularly cattle ranchers. In the 19th century, you have the Paraguayan War, which is this, you know, incredibly disastrous war for both sides of the border. And the Guaycurú and their descendants, the Cajueo, are, I think, in this period, they're figuring out how they can respond to new challenges of land encroachment and violence in the 19th century, but they do so drawing on some of these practices that they had used in the late 18th century. So in this kind of earlier colonial period with the Portuguese, which is not to say they're using the exact same practices, it's just that there's ways in which these things were flexible, and you can see that there were earlier precedents, for example, for these alliances and for them serving as military auxiliaries of the Portuguese, which then they are trying again with Brazilians in a changed context, but one in which these things are flexible enough to accommodate. And I guess I'm also curious to see how, if you compare the 18th and 19th century trajectories of these groups, you can see them over time working out how you could live close to whites, increasing number of them, and have different kinds of contact with them, trade, for example, and yet not settle in a sedentary way, not begin to adopt white norms of living. And I guess I see continuities in that, but also this flexibility in practices. And I need to clarify, when I eventually publish this, I think I need to clarify where the change is in the story.
Well, thank you for your comment. Yeah, actually, obviously, I was focusing on the lowland South American, which produces all these kind of questions. But you know that I'm not pretty sure that in Central America and elsewhere, their conception of architecture or monuments might be similar to the Westerns. Actually, there is a revision of this archaeological studies going on in Mexico nowadays, which is inspired by the ethnologists, the ethnology of lowland South America, mostly by the work of Eduardo Vieira de Castro and others. And they're beginning to understand that perhaps a Maya building or something like this might be a body building, might be a sort of extended person, you know, into what we conceive as a monument or a pyramid or something like this. So we don't know exactly what kind of concepts these people had of and have of architecture and durable things. So this is a question, it's an open question. So anyway, I think that again, we'll have a kind of equivocation between these different conceptions of what a monument or a architectonic construction is. So, and as for the other part, I'm also not pretty sure that there is this kind of, how can I say, of this asymmetry internal to the, for instance, the people that lives in the borders of the so-called empires. For instance, the Inca could never enter into the Amazonian basin because of the resistance of the Panoan and Arawakan-speaking peoples of the foothills. They never wanted exactly this to happen. There is a very complex relation of state resistance, if I can say like this, which points towards another mode of existence and another conception of power and permanence and so on. Even nowadays, when we bring natives to huge cities such as São Paulo, I did this sometimes, there's always a kind of lack of interest for big skyscrapers and things like that. They say, oh, we already saw this. Actually, our ancestors did this long ago. This was an invention of always about the myth of the twins, you know, the elder and the younger. We already did this in the first times. The whites actually learned this from us, and then they departed to another place. This is why they just are not completely interested exactly in this problem, but much more, for instance, in bottles, that when you go to a supermarket, you see a lot of bottles for storing water. And you see, for them, this is a kind of how these crazy people are storing water for selling, like, you know, thousands of bottles of water. This is something for them. It's a question. This produces questions, you know, but not exactly this proliferation of monuments, which for them is a kind of problem which was already conceived, and that the shamans have a reflection about this. But again, it's an opening. It's an open issue. We have to wait for the work of these archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists that are working in Mexico nowadays to see what we can say about this, the other monuments.
Do we have time for maybe one more question?
Well, it's more a comment really that I think connects both your points. Just bringing the idea of ephemerality to the context of Mesoamerica. I mean, when we look at those structures, you know, they are. When we. Well, but they are not separated, right? Well, let's think about Tenochtitlan and the structure of that city with a temple at the center, a temple that is basically like a Russian doll that's built upon with every new ruler, and that, you know, basically represents the end of a long journey of a migrant people. So we're only looking at the last 200 years of history, but before that, there had already been many different stations that had been abandoned for very different purposes, many of them probably environmentally related or having to do with the closing of a particular reign of somebody and needing to move along to somewhere else. So I think, yes, when we talk about these cultures as imperial cultures, we're already thinking from a different perspective. We have inherited that language from the early 16th century. But I think it's true that, you know, when we look at the materiality from a different perspective, this becomes much less stable.
I think maybe we could take a final question. Yeah.
Question for Pedro. The comment is just, that I think even to characterize Europeans' perceptions in the 16th century as having a clear hierarchy between great Mesoamerican and Andean cultures and Caribbean and Amazonian ones is not quite right. I mean, Oviedo, a canonical text in making these kinds of hierarchies, has huge appreciations for the material culture that is part of the broader lowland South Americas. He recommends that Europeans start using hammocks so that they can not die in war in Spain and Italy. He's a big fan of the thatching techniques for the longhouses and says that they're better than the European ones. And, you know, I could go on with a lot of examples. So I think we have to be careful about imposing a kind of Western view that emerges in the 18th and 19th century that wasn't actually fully in place in the 16th century. And then a specific question for Pedro. I'm wondering about the status of these material objects that you describe as extensions of the body with each other. Do they all, you know, you gave really compelling examples from houses and body painting and tobacco cases. Do they all work in the same way as extensions of the body, or are there ways to talk about differences between them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, actually, no. I don't have time. I didn't have time to develop this, but of course, no. They work in different ways. Again, I like this new vocabulary that Dana Haraway brought, and that Marilyn Stratton took from the gender studies to apply to anthropology. It is as if these different things have different capacities, you know, as in the cyborg metaphor. So each thing have a different capacity that you connect to other capacities, and then you create a kind of complex configuration. So I have to enter into specific details and tell you what exactly does this thing to sniff the tobacco powder produces, what kind of instrument of the person is this, of what exactly each kind of pattern can produce or activate, and etc. You know, but there are different capacities, of course.
So I guess we can continue some of this conversation over lunch, but a final round of thank you for our great presenters this morning. Yeah. Oh, yeah, and we're back here at 1:30.